Hello, this is a talk called Seeing the Forest and the Trees, Diagnostic Complexities in the Age of DSM-5. This is Fred Volkmar, MD. I'm the Irving B. Harris Professor at the Child Study Center of Yale University and the Dorothy Goodwin Endowed Chair of Special Education at Southern Connecticut State University. You can see my emails below, and you can also see this talk is dated September 25, 2020. My disclosures: I have money from the NIH Autism Center of Excellence grant to Kasia Havarska, as well as book royalties from Springer, Wiley, Cambridge, and Guilford Press. I'm paid to be the editor of the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, and also the Encyclopedia of Autism. I would like to particularly thank some colleagues who helped in terms of this particular presentation: Roald Oyen in Norway, Mark Woodbury-Smith in England, and Susan Carey here at Yale. So we're going to talk about today's talk in just a second. And I also want to mention that there are further talks in this series. If you visit our websites, you will see there's a talk a month scheduled for the rest of this academic year. So let me say a little bit about what's going to happen in today's talk. We're going to do a discussion of the overview of the discovery of autism and then the origins of the broad versus narrow concept, which goes back really quite a while. And we'll go from Connor to DSM-3, covering about 40 years, then the origins of DSM, then from DSM-3 to DSM-5 and its impact, and then the current controversies. And finally, a summary of where we go from here. So let me say a word about the discovery of autism. In the first place, was there autism before Connor? Almost certainly yes. The most, probably the earliest reports were of feral children. These date from Roman times, if not before. Victor the Wild Boy in France, reported by Itard, may be the first case. This may be a child who was either abandoned or bolted, ran away from his parents. Donovan and Zucker, in a different key, their history of autism, found reports from state training schools in the 1800s here in the US of children who likely had autism. Leo Kanner in 1943, the first child psychiatrist in the country, gave the classic description of early infantile autism. He said there were two essential features. One was autism and the other was insistence on sameness and resistance to change. We'll talk more about this in a second. He also noted the language and communication issues, and he believed that autism was something that was inborn, that had its onset even before birth. He also mentioned in his description some things that turned out to be false leads. His impression was of possibly normal levels of intelligence because on some tasks on the IQ test, the children did well, typically puzzles, nonverbal things. They didn't do well in the whole test. It took people a long time to sort out that, in fact, they don't do well in the rest of the test. He thought autism was not related to other medical conditions. We now know that's not true at all, that autism is very frequently related to other conditions, especially some genetic conditions, and especially to seizures. And his early cases, many of the parents were very successful and well educated. With hindsight, we can understand that was because those are the people who could figure out there's one child psychiatrist in the country to go to with their child. It was taken in the 50s to somehow support the notion that perhaps the parents caused the child's autism because they were so striving and successful, they had somehow left the child out. A year after Connor published, Hans Asperger, who you see on the right, was a medical student at the time in Vienna. He wrote a paper on boys who had trouble joining social groups. He called this autistic personality disorder. He used the same word, autism. He talked about this more as a personality trait rather than a developmental disorder. These are boys who came to diagnosis much later, actually. They all had special interests that interfered with functioning, both their functioning in terms of learning, but also in the family's quality of life. He also was really the person who highlighted genetics. He talked about similar problems in fathers. There was little interest in his condition until 1980 when Werner Wing in England published a description in English along with a series of case reports. This is really the origins of conceptualizations, and its various vicissitudes start with Wing because over time, at least 6, if not more, different views of Asperger's developed. All cite Werner Wing as their source of inspiration, and all end up being somewhat different. She saw this clearly as part of the broader autism spectrum. And it's important to note here that there are other concepts as well. Atypical personality development was described in the 1940s by Beata Rank. Schizoid children, other children, Sula Wolf's discussion of loners. This is the beginning of the debate about what's now called the broader autism phenotype. This book, Neurotribes, talks some about the history of this broader phenotype. So what's in a name? The Greek word autos actually has several different meanings depending upon its grammatical context. It can either be used to refer to self, but it also can have its own sense of referring to same. And it's interesting that in those two senses, it captures both things that Leo Kanner was talking about. And so it's a very appropriate term for the condition that he described. Early development of autism as a concept. Well, in the first place, there was considerable confusion with childhood schizophrenia. We'll talk more about this until the things were clarified in 1980. Some aspects of Kanner's report, as I mentioned, were served as false leads. But during the 1970s, several different lines of evidence emerged that were really important in helping validate the autism as a distinctive diagnostic concept. First of all, it was brain-based. There are high rates of epilepsy, often with an onset in the teenage years. Autism was strongly genetic. The first twin studies were done that showed much higher rates in identical as compared to fraternal twins. Also, autism was discovered to respond better to structured teaching rather than unstructured psychotherapy. In the meantime, work on childhood schizophrenia, strictly defined, showed that it was actually quite rare, especially before puberty. Its onset was much later than autism. It differed from autism, its clinical features, and family history. In the 1970s, there were the first attempts to develop better explicit diagnostic guidelines for autism. Notably, Rudder in 1978 talked about social and language features that were not due to just associated mental retardation, or as we would now call it, intellectual disability. And he also talked about the restricted interest in early onset. Ritvo in the National Society of Autistic Children definition talked about unusual rates and sequences of development and unusual sensitivities to the environment. Just a very short word about classification. Why classify? Well, of course, the general interest in scientific classification goes back to Linnaeus, who was talking about the differentiation of species and genus. And this was really, of course, critical in serving as the foundation for Darwin's work in understanding evolution and biological relationships among species, and of course, now much more recently in terms of the biology. But in medicine, the origins of the 1980s, things about causes of death began to be of interest. And we saw that things, for example, in England, if you read the nice book, The Ghost Map, talks about the discovery of the cholera wells. There were some wells in London that were polluted with sewage, and it caused cholera. And closing those wells down led to a cessation of the cholera epidemic. So sort of the first practical application of epidemiology. And it's served as a reminder that even before we knew about germs, antibiotics, disinfectant, people could take steps to minimize illness. And that was one of the important backgrounds to this whole body of work on classification. Classification is intended to enhance communication and research. It also helps with epidemiology and service planning. There are almost always tensions between clinical and research purposes. Research purposes tend to be much more stringent. Clinical, of course, is by its nature somewhat broader. There are different approaches to classification. Categorical, yes, no, you have it. Dimensional, how much of it do you have? Idiographic is actually more the approach to the person as a single person with all their strengths and weaknesses and all their difficulties. In the medicine, the International Classification of Diseases is the world standard. The DSM, the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is considered a local variant on the part of the ICD, but in fact, it dominates the world in terms of research. There are a number of common misconceptions. Disorders, not people, are classified. We don't equate people with their disorders. Labels, in this country especially, the US, may give entitlements to service. And assigning a label is not the same thing as having an explanation. It's also important to realize that there are constraints on systems of classification that can be very complicated to deal with in terms of things like coverage, how everyone who needs service, you have to have a way of providing a diagnostic category of some kind. And so there are many, many, many tensions that go into designing a logically consistent and reliable and valid classification system. So from DSM-1 to DSM-3, DSM-1 and 2, these were very heavily influenced by theory. There were only a few categories available for children: mental retardation, childhood schizophrenia, adjustment reactions, and a number of other reactions. Autism was not officially recognized. It was thought to be a form of childhood schizophrenia. By the time DSM-3 rolled around in 1980, there had been a very important impact of the Washington University School of Psychiatry approach. They developed research diagnostic criteria, basically saying, what are the facts? Forget the theories. What are the facts? What can we agree on are the essential features that define this condition? They also adopted a multi-axial framework, and they specifically included subthreshold categories. So atypical PDD, essentially the broader autism phenotype cases. Now, it's important to note here that beyond, both DSM-3 and beyond are intended for clinical and research work. ICD has adopted a different approach. It has one book for research diagnostic criteria and one book for clinical descriptions. DSM-3 was the first to recognize in the DSMs that infantile autism is a category. It indeed recognized it as infantile autism. It coined a new term, the pervasive developmental disorders, and it put autism in that class. There was infantile autism and residual infantile autism for people who had once had infantile autism. There was a very rare condition called childhood onset PDD for children who developed autism after years of normal development, and then a residual category for children who had once had this. This category actually is probably unintentionally the old Heller syndrome, or more recently childhood disintegrative disorder. These are very, very, very rare children who develop autism after some years of normal development. It's very uncommon, very interesting. But DSM-3 included it because they wanted it to be comprehensive. And then this atypical PDD. This is the one that essentially, although not necessarily intentionally, represented what now would be thought of as the broader autism phenotype. The good news is that it was great to have recognition, and that spurred a lot of research. On the other hand, the lack of developmental orientation and complexities of diagnosis were a problem. The definition given was for quote-unquote infantile autism, pervasive lack of social responsiveness to other people, for example. You had to have all the criteria mentioned. They were all really focused on the youngest children with the disorder. Not so much infants, but really very young children, and the most severe form of the disorder. And so that's why they had this funny category of residual infantile autism. That was not a great term, because the problems that people with so-called residual infantile autism had were pretty real. They weren't so residual at all. So, sorry, let me go back. From DSM-3 to DSM-4, several things happened. These problems with DSM-3 were quickly recognized. DSM-3R in 1987 adopted a different approach to autistic disorder. This was a better name for the condition. We had more criteria now grouped in the traditional three areas of social communication and restricted interest, repetitive behaviors. It was a much more flexible definition. You could have a couple from one, a couple from another, up to a certain total. It was a very nicely oriented, developmentally oriented definition. It unfortunately was probably a little bit overly broad, especially at the ends of the spectrum of cognitive functioning. So there was a major redo very quickly in DSM-4. There were several things that were really quite different in DSM-4 from the previous revisions of the autism section. For autism, this included invited reviews of very specific topics like Asperger's disorder, Rett's disorder, data reanalyses of data that were available, and also the DSM-4 team worked with the ICD-10 team in revision, so that the goal was, if we could possibly do it, to have the DSM-4 definition and the ICD-10 definition be fundamentally the same. Most importantly, there was a field trial that was undertaken over the course of a year to establish the new criteria. This field trial was an international effort. There were 20-some sites around the world, rating 125 raters, rating almost 1,000 cases. We gathered information on the case and the rater, the clinician's diagnosis, the rater's experience, and information about the case, and information on the rater. Then the rater did various criteria sets, and we came up with a final set of 12 items in the three areas: social, communication, restrictive behaviors, and you had to have at least 6, 2 from the social. For experienced clinicians, there was very good array of reliability. And I should also point out that we could look at factor analyses. We could have had 2, 3, or 5 groups of items. We stuck with the original 3. That was a perfectly defensible position. We could have combined social communication, as later was done with DSM-5. We specifically did not do that, partly because historically that had not been how it was done, but also this 3-area approach gave us much greater flexibility. So for autistic disorder in DSM-4, there were over 2,000 ways to get a diagnosis. We also gave new categories compatible with ICD-10. These included Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett's disorder, which subsequently has been shown to be a single gene disorder, and the broader autism phenotype category of pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. Asperger's disorder is interesting. It's worth some little discussion. From 1944 to 1994, there was very little interest until Lorna Wing's 1981 paper, who suggested some modifications. She gave case reports, and she very much talked about the continuities with autism. After her work, several different views arose of the matter. As I mentioned, all of them citing her as being seminal in terms of their conceptualization, but all being somewhat different. Subsequent research, which did start to increase quite dramatically, was limited by small samples and a certain tendency towards circularity. People would define Asperger's a certain way and then discover that it was as they had defined it. There were inconsistent approaches. At the same time, though, interestingly enough, there seemed to be convergence with other concepts coming from other disciplines. Nonverbal learning disabilities, right hemisphere learning disability from neurology, semantic pragmatic processing disorder from the speech and language world, schizoid personality in psychiatry, and NLD was from psychology. It's interesting that in the DSM-4 field trial, we had, I think, 48 cases of where the clinician had said, I think this is Asperger's. And we looked at these cases compared to high functioning autism and also to PD and OS and discovered there were some important significant differences. So this was really good evidence for including Asperger's as a category. There was considerable resistance, unfortunately, to the inclusion. The DSM-4 definition that was adopted was somewhat problematic. It had been changed at the last minute outside of the scope of the review committee at a much higher level. The text had been very radically changed. And there are lots of complexities about this. Research has certainly increased since the time Asperger's was first included, but the DSM-4 definition by no way settled the debate about the best approach to diagnosis. PDD and OS, as I mentioned, this is essentially pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, the broader category of people who have some difficulty suggestive of autism, but not really the full autism syndrome. There is this early backstory of attempts in the 40s to talk about atypical children. At first, we were not at all sure that this was really related to autism. As time has gone on, the genetics has shown this really tremendous complexity, and work on family members of people with autism have shown that, much to our surprise, there can be apparently a subtle shading off into normalcy, with siblings having some traits or parents having some traits. Sometimes siblings may have some things we see on MRI that are intermediate between neurotypical and folks with autism. In terms of interpreting things like biological motion. Subtypes have been proposed. These have not necessarily all been consistently agreed upon, but some people say that we should be looking for kids with more attentional problems, others with more language problems, others with more thought problems, others with more affective lability. Again, one of the problems has been this has been such an amorphous, although large category, that's been difficult to study. It is clear that the genetics on this disorder are very complex. This is a slide from Emory University, recently looking at some of the genetics of autism with some single gene disorders, but also some with a very common set of multiple genes involved. At the moment, when this slide was done, about 8% yield in terms of finding some genetic complexity. That number is now significantly higher when you do genetic testing for autism. So the broader autism phenotype is a very interesting topic itself. Several lines of work have begun to converge. Work from psychology showed the notion that people, for example, siblings, might have some features of autism without the whole syndrome or necessarily without any symptoms at all, apparently. I mentioned the family members may have some similarities, neurobiological research and epidemiology. This is a condition that's much more common than more classically defined autism, and it may reflect the complicated genetics of the condition. So a momentary pause. Nearly 2 decades pass. Research on autism after DSM-4 and ICD-10 literally explodes. Both DSM and ICD start to excuse me, both DSM and ICD start to think about revisions. There are good reasons for this: more knowledge and better understanding of the attempt to want to tweak disorders. And there's some less good reasons. The DSM is if not the major source of income for the APA, and the DSM-4 was losing steam in terms of its monetary income. Excuse me again. So DSM-5 is a little bit of a surprise in some ways. Several decades had passed since DSM-4, almost two. There were some basic decisions made early on. We eliminated all subthreshold categories. That's all of DSM-5. That's a little problematic. We looked at new approaches. This is taking instruments like the ADOS and the ADI, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Scale, the Autism Diagnostic Interview, themselves keyed to DSM-4 and ICD-10, looking at those data, which had been developed for research purposes and require considerable training. These are instruments that you have to really have several days of training to become reliable and using those data to derive criteria. There was a field trial, but I put it in quotes because it really looked more at reliability, not so much at the broader context of how things worked in the real world. Also, the field trial was based at APA headquarters rather than an academic institution, which sort of speaks to some of the issues involved. And in contrast to previous versions of the DSM, several members of the original panel resigned during the DSM-5 development process, basically protesting the fact that they thought things had gone awry, and I was one of those members. So let me say a word about using research instruments to derive criteria. These are excellent instruments. They do require extensive training, and they come from DSM-4 and ICD-10 in the first place. So the dog starts chasing its tail. They're not designed for routine clinical use. Some poor doctor out in the middle of nowhere is pulling off a book from the shelf to read about autism, to think about a case that he is all of a sudden dealing with. He is being now shown criteria derived from these diagnostic and research instruments for which he's had no training. The background really to all these diagnostic instruments is that they were really first developed for school-age children, mostly boys, of borderline to mild intellectual disability, and they don't work so well for older and younger people, nor for the more cognitively and the less cognitively able. Also in this case, I mentioned the factor analysis. This was used to justify moving from a 3-category approach to a 2-category approach. I mentioned that we had chosen 3 categories because it was consistent with one of several solutions in factor analysis of the DSM-4. The 2-category approach, of course, is simpler in some ways, but it also limits you in terms of your options, in terms of numbers of ways to get the diagnosis. Another way to put this is that not everything can and should be combined. Even when you have good numbers, as in this case, the numbers may be perfectly accurate, but the sum is perfectly meaningless. So the DSM-5 decisions, we dropped PDD in favor of autism spectrum disorder. This is a very welcome change. But let me point out that this is autism spectrum disorder, not disorders. And a spectrum, of course, should imply disorders. The overall decisions that were complicated, we only had autism spectrum disorder. We dropped Asperger's, we dropped PDOS. We have a new communication disorder, social communication disorder. It only works for some children because it's a communication disorder. It doesn't work for children who have repetitive behaviors, for example. For autism spectrum disorder, I mentioned we moved from 3 categories to 2. There's a new category, new criterion included about hyper and hyposensitivity as one of the so-called resistance change features. This is something that we had looked at in DSM-4, and we had not included it then because it had not worked well. It was very confounded with intellectual disability. We also moved from what had been a previously mixed polyphetic model of some from A, some from B, some from C, for a total number, to a mixed decision where you had to have all the social communication and then at least 2 of the 4 resistance to change. And we had specific ways to denote severity. So essentially we moved from over 2,000 ways to 12 ways to get the diagnosis. Do you think this concept might be a narrower one? Well, the first report on DSM-5 came out in 2011. This study was done using the then DSM-5 criteria that they had. One of the issues was that these kept changing. And furthermore, people who signed up for DSM had agreed not to disclose details of the process. So there was a confidentiality, a do not disclose agreement. which made life a little complicated. But this was the study that was done with a slightly earlier version of the DSM-5 criteria on a large sample, children in Finland. And they discovered there were really problems, especially with higher IQ cases losing their diagnosis. But the DSM-5 folks, well, said that, they're not really using our final criterion set. My colleague Jamie McPartland, Brian Reichow, and I did a reanalysis of 933 cases that we could find from the DSM-4 field trial set, where we found the original paper criteria ratings, actually. And we went back and did a crosswalk to the new DSM-5 criteria and found that of the cases with ASD, 60% retained their diagnosis, which means 40% lost. The sensitivity was high. So if you got a label of autistic disorder, yes, you sure had autistic disorder. But we saw that there were really great variations with IQ and also by diagnostic label. And this next slide from the New York Times, published in January of 2012, shows this even more dramatically. This is a slide that was presented a day after I had presented these data at a talk in Iceland, of all places. And I got woken during the middle of the night in Iceland by a zillion pings on my phone. This was on the first page, the front page of the New York Times, pointing out that many children were going to lose their label. And as a result, they would lose their services in the US. And this was about 75% of cases with Asperger's, almost 80% of those with PDOS, and interestingly enough, about a quarter of the children with more classical autism, and they tended to be the higher functioning ones. This was very much a function both of IQ, but also not having the quote unquote classic Connors autism. So other studies and responses, well, it's interesting. In the first place, the response of the DSM-5 work group to this unpleasant news from the New York Times and from our paper, which was subsequently published in the American Journal of the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, was okay, they would grandfather in well-established cases. Now, if you take a second to just sort of stop and think about that, what does that mean? Well, in the first place, it means that the old system continues in current use. And you say, well, that's okay, but what if you're doing an epidemiological study? What if you are doing a longitudinal study and all of a sudden you disqualify your cases? What in the world is going on? It's as if you're running two trains on the same track at the same time without their knowing of each other where they're at in terms of where they are on the line. Initially, these two problems were identified. Firstly, the major problems with high functioning autism and Asperger's, that was very quickly supported by a number of studies. Also, interestingly enough, with very young children, many younger children were not making a diagnosis of autistic disorder in DSM-5, so they wouldn't be eligible for services, and because they didn't have a label, and thus they would not potentially profit from earlier identification and treatment. A meta-analysis by Isaac Smith and his colleagues back in 2015 looked at 25 studies and basically supported this view that the DSM-5 is very problematic at the ranges of at the top end of the high functioning and low functioning age, younger and older, that it had a number of problems, and these have now been shown in 25 studies. So the broader autism phenotype, as I mentioned, about 85% of cases no longer qualified for an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. Does the new SCD, social communication disorder category, work for them? Well, no, not really. It's a category that's used for pragmatic language deficits. There's no restrictive repetitive behaviors. It's much more restrictive than the old PDOS concept. It specifically excludes people with autism spectrum disorder, and it does not simply equate with the broader autism phenotype. There have only been a handful of studies since it first was proposed. Helen Hager-Flussberg in 2018 raised some very interesting questions about the wisdom of having this category at all. In contrast, the broader phenotype since DSM-5 came out, there have been about 36 studies. And there have also been some suggestions of the broader autism phenotype in siblings. Clearly has a more heterogeneous expression. Also clearly has very strong connections to family expression and genetic factors in the disorder. Asperger's presents some very interesting problems. Before DSM-4, there were very different approaches to diagnosis. As I mentioned, at least 6 probably. Asperger's criteria, quote unquote, were used by Wing, but in fact, she doesn't really give criteria. The disorder as proposed in DSM-4 was somewhat problematic, as I mentioned, for complicated reasons. Problems were quickly noted in this. Major changes were made in the text. Interestingly enough, the text in DSM-4 TR text revision is the text that was originally proposed for Asperger's back in the original DSM-4, had gotten taken out by the powers that be, and their text was so bad that the old text was put back, but their changes were not made in the criteria. So, as noted previously, about 75% of cases with Asperger's lose autistic spectrum disorder as a label. Unfortunately, one of the problems here is the cat is out of the bag. You can see from 1944 to 1981, there were 8 papers on Asperger's. From 82 to 91, there were 15 papers. Once it was recognized, there's 2,284 papers. So whatever else is true, indeed, the cat is out of the bag. Asperger's disorder is out there. People talk about it. They identify as having it. And they don't really see themselves as fitting in, nor do the family see themselves as fitting into the sort of more classic autism spectrum. So why delete it? And you can see the Sheriff of Nottingham over here, who turns out I have an ancient ancestor who was a Sheriff of Nottingham. There were very different views from center to center. There was a paper that came out that said basically there are very different views from center to center, so get rid of it. And this, I think, seems very unfortunate. There was a non-peer reviewed paper by Frankie Happe that basically made this point. So these were taken as arguments for getting rid of it. Of course, the problem is the fact that we can't refine the definition doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Many people identified with it, although the label supposedly was folded in. In fact, it was excluded from DSM-5, and these are children that then would not receive services. And it's not uncommon. And I just had a person consult with me who's too old to get the new ASD label in any case, but who really has Asperger's. So this is a major, major issue. Furthermore, it's a problem dealing with these more able cases that come to diagnosis later. A study by Sue White that's cited in the reference list later on, she took her incoming, I presume, psychology class, gave them 2 measures, one of a more categorical nature for autism and one of a more dimensional nature, and found between basically 0.5 and 1% of college students tested positive for autism, even though they didn't know they had it. Which is an interesting point, that there are people out there who haven't had services, who don't know they have services, who may come to diagnosis later once it becomes clear as things become more difficult. So Asperger's post-DSM-5 is interesting because data continue to emerge. A very interesting study by Chiang and her colleagues in 2014 did a meta-analysis of 52 studies of over 1,000 cases of high-functioning autism, 1,000 cases of Asperger's, and found 3 things. The individuals with Asperger's had significantly higher full-scale IQ than the autism group. Within the individuals with Asperger's, they had significantly higher verbal than nonverbal IQs. And within the high-functioning IQ, the verbal IQ was rather similar to the performance IQ. This is what several of us had said way back when in talking about one of the reasons for having Asperger's in as a potential subtype. It has important implications for interventions. If people with Asperger's have better verbal abilities, we can use those verbal abilities to help focus on nonverbal problems. Age-related issues in adults. Well, it's interesting, as Asperger first pointed out, many fathers in his sample had problems similar to their son. And many individuals, as we know, come to diagnosis rather later. I mentioned the Sue White study showing that a certain percent of college freshmen had either of 2 approaches to a diagnosis of autism. There clearly are complex differences in presentation. If you're presenting for diagnosis as a 20 or a 25-year-old, you've had a lot of time to grow and develop. You may have had other problems develop. We know that people on the autism spectrum are prone to develop anxiety and depression, other problems. All these things can complicate the diagnosis. You have to remember for DSM-5 where these instruments come from, the work on school-aged children, mild to moderate, sort of borderline intellectual disability. So reviews by Jackson, as well as with Majdi and Helen, talk about some of the problems with applying the DSM-5 in older individuals, and failing to pick up a case early in life may now become a disqualifier for a label and thus for services and insurance coverage. Young children present special problems. There's been very strong interest in work on younger children. We now study a lot of at-risk groups, especially siblings who are at known risk for having autism. We know that early diagnosis and treatment can make a major difference. And we also are aware there's a broad range of issues in terms of autism, and there's screening issues as well as developmental course issues. With DSM-5, several studies quickly started to point to a problem. In a study by Matson, about 50% of toddlers lost their diagnosis with DSM-5. A study by Mays reported 72% of those diagnosed with a PADD under DSM-4 lost their label. The problems can take several forms. We know that not all children exhibit all problems until age 3 or so. People grow in and out of the label. The lack of the atypical criteria category is a problem because we used to be able to say, well, at the moment, this is PDNOS or atypical autism. We'll have to see how the child develops over time. Some children moved into autism. Some children stayed where they were. Some children moved off the spectrum. Sadly, that was the less common, but you did see it. Social communication disorder, as I mentioned, it's not clear that it really gets you much service in the first place, and not clear that it works so well with young children. So the bottom line is we removed a substantial number of young children from service eligibility at a very important time, and this is a very serious problem. Gender issues. This is an emerging area of awareness. There's an implicit assumption that the criteria are agnostic to gender, but is this true? Well, there are several studies that seem to show, and I mentioned one here, females with ASD seem to require more symptom severity and greater impairment, but it may be that females are more likely to exhibit internalizing behaviors than males. They're more likely to act in, as it were. They're less disruptive. They may also be better at camouflaging their symptoms. Both of these things might basically hide their symptomatology, so they might not be picked up as much. There are some studies that show they're less likely to engage in recurrent repetitive behaviors. I mentioned the males have more externalizing behaviors. The females have better social skills, may show better attention, while still very significantly socially impaired. They're less disruptive. So there's a whole package of things here, including on screening tests. It turns out in large studies, there are gender differences on screening items in the typical population. So the bottom line is there may have been and continue to be an unintended but systematic bias against the diagnosis of autism in females. Cultural issues. This comes from two sources, and I'll explain Hollywood in just a second. There's a growing interest in autism in developing countries around the world. In the developing countries, we have better public health and better public health measures. Children are more likely to survive. People are more aware of children with disabilities and want to intervene with them. It's important to keep in mind that cultural differences may be very, very important in terms of thinking not only about diagnosis, but also about treatment. This is a very interesting problem. It's something that's various national, international groups are focused on with much interest right now. But there's also great awareness within the United States of the potential of culture for impacting bias in diagnosis. I mentioned Hollywood here because there's a published study showing rates of autism in Los Angeles. The highest rates are in Beverly Hills. The lowest rates are in the poorest sections of Los Angeles, East Los Angeles, Watts. What does that mean? Do we think that really means there are marked epidemiological variations that are due to living a couple of miles apart? No. What does it reflect? A bias against giving a diagnosis, a bias against even thinking about a diagnosis. On the one hand, in the impoverished communities, in the communities with a lot of money and wealth and support, having an autism label is kind of snazzy in the sense that it gets you the most supports. People feel more positive about it because with supports, children with autism are doing better. And so again, even within our own country, even within one city, you can see the potential for cultural bias. Autism across cultures has a small but growing literature, and I would recommend the article by Frith and colleagues. There are some obvious cultural differences in things like eye contact. The vast majority of research work is done in Western cultures. Roy Grinker has talked about the very significant cultural issues that may impact both diagnosis and treatment. And we see problems at several levels with screening instruments, diagnostic instruments, the usual diagnostic criteria, and the need for coordination and involvement of various stakeholders and respect for cultural variations and practice, that we can't just pluck down our US models of diagnosis and care into developing countries. We have to work with the developing countries and developing models that will be appropriate for them. Again, within the United States, there seems to be underdiagnosis in minority groups, especially inner city groups, potentially other issues as well. Some communication features seem to be more problematic in certain cultures. There seem to be lower levels of communication skills in some minority groups, even when parent education is controlled for. Screening instruments may operate somewhat differently. There may be some bias on the part of Hispanic families, for example, to be more positive reporters of symptoms suggestive of autism. And there's some suggestion of item response differences based on maternal education. So all these things may impact lower rates of diagnosis in inner city population. I've given you a few references here, and there's a fairly large body of work on this now. And yet one more issue, comorbidity. Comorbidity is the problem of having more than one problem. Having a significant developmental vulnerability like ASD only makes you more vulnerable to other problems. And we know with age these develop. School-age children may also have attention deficit disorder. They may start to develop anxiety problems. In adolescence, people become more anxious and may become more depressed. And there are many others as well. These are often real complexities to sort out, especially in dealing with a higher functioning person, as I've mentioned, who comes to you at age 20 or 18, who's gone to college, and all of a sudden somebody mentions that they have difficulties that are suggestive of Asperger's or autism, and you have to disentangle this whole complicated picture. So in summary, there's been much progress since the first description of autism in the 1940s. We are indeed paddling upstream, but we are paddling ever so slowly. We had official recognition of autism and now Asperger's autism spectrum disorder. We know that treatments have been developed that are effective. We have a growing body of basic and applied research. We have some continuing and new challenge. The tensions between broad and narrow views of autism are continuing. At the moment, the narrow view dominates. In the past, the broader view dominated. And we'll have to see how the pendulum swings. It would be nice to end up somewhere in the middle. Asperger's and autism, same or different, is a major problem. As I mentioned, Asperger's, that cat's out of the bag. The best way is how to deal with it. And just pretending it's not there is not the best way. We know that there are age and developmental issues, that gendered issues are probably very much underappreciated, and increasingly there's a body of work on cultural issues. We would like to be looking for biomarkers, and several things are right now in process to be looked at as potential biological markers for autism or risk for autism. We should try to work with rather than against complexity and balance research and service needs. Probably most importantly, we need to build in a good amount of common sense in terms of coming up with a better approach to diagnosis. And hopefully these issues will be addressed in DSM 5.1. So let me end with a quote from an Albanian poet. Having been talking about forests and trees today, only with the leaf can I talk of the forest. Thank you very much. Here are some references. And my emails first as we end. And you will have a reference list on the website that you can access. Thank you again very much.